This is Ancient and Medieval History Lecture for Wednesday. Yes, the 22nd of September, 2022. And where we had been was one of the darkest places that we go in history, the final solution to the Jewish question. Now, when the camps were liberated, I'll give you an example. As American troops approached Buchenwald in western Germany, which was a fairly small camp compared to the ones in the east, the smell was evident before they got through the woods to the camp, like nothing they had smelled before. And these guys, combat veterans, they were used to battlefields where thousands of dead lied unburied. When they approached, they saw what seemed to be a bunch of barracks, but there were dead all over the place, sometimes piled up, sometimes leaning against buildings, and then many of the dead began to move. They looked like human skeletons. When you see a person who has been systematically starved, their legs are as thin as twigs except for the joints around their knees and their feet, which are huge. They look bulbous, outsized. The skin becomes translucent so that you can see things, the shadows of things moving underneath. And they approached the Americans like zombies to touch them. The inmates wanted to see if the Americans were real. Now, the same thing happened to the Russians and to the British. The gates were opened. People who had been trapped in these camps were allowed to wander outside. And the natural impulse is to feed starving people. So American soldiers and British soldiers and Russian soldiers, each in their own way, even Russian soldiers who were notably brutal to everyone, including each other, began feeding these people until urgent orders came from headquarters: do not let these people out of the camp. Round them up, get them back inside. Do not feed them much. Wait for instructions. Now, this was heartbreaking for American troops to have to move the victims back into the camp and to stop feeding them. But what had begun to happen was that people who had not been used to taking in food, except for maybe a little bit of broth with some potato peels in it, were suddenly given real food. And their bodies, which existed at such a delicate balance, couldn't handle it. They died. Thousands died from not the cruelty of the Nazis exactly, although they were the primary cause. The immediate cause of death was the kindness and generosity of the Allies, because you feed a starving person. And these weren't just men, they were women and children. Razor-thin features on their face, and the indescribable look in their eyes. So headquarters eventually gave instructions on how to properly feed starving people so that you don't kill them. That was good. But as to why they were forced back into the camps temporarily, it was because film crews and other documentarians had to come and make sure that the evidence was not lost of these crimes, these indescribable crimes. So film crews came, and reporters, photographers, and it seemed unbelievable what had happened to these people, intentionally on purpose. What the Allies eventually did, particularly in the American and British zones, is they took all the Germans anywhere near these camps and brought them inside to clean them up, to witness what had happened in their name. Now, for psychological reasons I cannot fathom, there are people who deny that it happened. Well, I have personally known 2 victims of the Holocaust. I have met dozens. I knew a guy who helped liberate one of the camps. It's not even in question. What does the world do with that? Now, there are reports that evidence had been smuggled out of occupied Europe, but the British didn't take it seriously beyond a certain point, because in World War I, in order to whip up public support, the British intelligence service had engaged in propaganda depicting the Germans in Belgium as baby killers, as ravening Huns. And to avoid any pretense of that, just the sheer magnitude of the horror of this, it seemed like propaganda. It seemed like stories that you tell about your enemies being monsters, which is why you need to fight them. But these were real. In the case of the American State Department, we got evidence. But the American State Department, otherwise known as Foggy Bottom, was and remains an institution that's fairly closed to the outside and to outside influences. The American State Department, our diplomatic service, also unfortunately had a fair share of anti-Semites. So the stories either weren't believed because they were too graphic, they were too much. Come on, let's get real. If you're going to make something up, make it plausible. Or they decided that there was nothing that we could do about it. These camps were hundreds or over 1,000 miles behind enemy lines when we got this information in the mid-war. We couldn't do anything. We couldn't send troops in at that point. All we could do is bomb the camps. Now, many Jews after the war say that's what you should have done. We were going to die anyway. At least some Germans would have died with us. But that's a hell of a decision to make. You've got camps where crimes against humanity are occurring. What do you do about it? Do you bomb them? Does that make it better or worse? It's not an easy call. Ultimately, the Allies decided that the way you deal with the concentration camps, the labor camps and the death camps, is you win the war. That's the goal. Win the war. If you win the war, you stop the camps. And ultimately, that's what happened. Now, after World War II, the surviving victims of the final solution were only some of what were called dispos, dispossessed people, displaced people, people whose homes were gone, whose countries had moved or were gone. But they certainly had gone through the worst. What to do? Well, the British had opened the door to a possible answer. In the late 1800s, before World War I or II, Theodor Herzl establishes Jewish nationalist organization, Zionist organization, named for Mount Zion near Jerusalem. Zionism is the belief that the only place Jews will be at home and will be safe will be in the Promised Land. which at that time was ruled by the Ottoman Turks, an Islamic government. And some Jews, with Ottoman permission, bought land, migrated in, and began farming, small groups. Oddly enough, many of these joined the Turkish military when World War I began, and the Turks were fighting against the British and the French, the Russians, and ultimately the Americans. But in 1917, with the help of Lawrence of Arabia, British forces liberate Jerusalem. And to commemorate this, and to get money and support from Jews around the world, the British declare, it's called the Balfour Declaration. It's a public statement on behalf of the British government, saying that if we, British Empire, win the war, that we will establish a Jewish homeland within Palestine. For the first time since the Emperor Hadrian, a major power was interested in Zionism, in returning Jews in some respect, some way, shape, or form, to the Promised Land. However, after the war, the British realized that their Arab allies were not thrilled with this idea, to say the least, because this area, even though they had admitted a few Jews, was overwhelmingly Arab. I'm not going to use the term Palestinian because there was no Palestinian identity then. They were just Arabs, like Syria. The British then, during the period between World War I and World War II, tried to please both sides and ended up provoking violent anger on both sides. On the one hand, the British do permit Jewish immigration. Not enough to please the Zionists, too much to appease the Arabs. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the leader of the Arabs in Palestine, declares that he will never be reconciled to Jews in what he calls Palestine, and that resistance against the British and the Jews was authorized. So some Arabs began engaging in terrorism against the Jews and against the British. But the Jews said, no, we're not going to be victims of violence. This isn't Russia. We're not going to put up with pogroms. So two Jewish organizations are set up that attack both Arabs and British. So the British are getting it from both sides. Haganah is set up to bring in Jews and establish a free country, Israel. Irgun is set up to do the same thing, but with much, much more brutal force. World War II happens. Hajj Amin al-Husseini becomes a house guest of Hitler on several occasions. Hitler tells him, I'm not going to tell anyone else yet. I'm going to tell you because you'll understand. I intend to wipe out the Jews of Europe, exterminate them. And Husseini says, I will keep this secret in my heart. He told his people. Had the Germans broken through to Cairo, they were coming from Libya, the Arab world would probably have risen up against the British in support of the Germans, because the Germans wanted to kill the Jews, and by this point many Arabs, both inside and outside Palestine, were angry at the idea of Jewish immigration, and they were okay with exterminating Jews that went to the Middle East. After World War II, the world is stunned by the revelations of the final solution. What are we going to do about it? The Jews who survive, both inside Europe and outside Europe, know damn well what they're going to do about it. Herzl was right. The only place on earth we're going to be safe from the anti-Semites is in our own country. So Haganah and Irgun began importing people from Europe, sneaking them through a British blockade. Britain after World War II is bankrupt. It's exhausted financially, physically, morally. And it says to the new United Nations organization, which later becomes literally the most corrupt institution humanity has ever produced. But at this time, the UNO was still young and fairly useful. The British say to the UNO, hot potato, we're out of Palestine. In 1948, we're leaving. Come up with a plan. So the British are going to leave. And in 1947, the UN looks over a plan. Now, roughly, let's see, it's way too close. This is the border of Palestine. Jerusalem's about here. That's a little farther east. So what the United Nations does is it divides Palestine. The Arabs are going to get the west bank of the Jordan, the area around Jerusalem. Actually, that's west. $10 miles. And the Jews are going to get the rest. Now, before this, around the end of World War I, Palestine had included the area across the Jordan. It was called Transjordan. At first, that was given to the Arabs to be their state. But the Arabs who still lived here said that's not enough. So the United Nations was going to give the Jews this area and the Arabs this area. Oh, and also the area of the Gaza Strip. Now this may look like a lot, but Israel is very small. And down here is mostly desert. Nothing can live there unless you ship everything in. Then there's a vote in 1947. Does the United Nations approve the partition of Palestine and the establishment of the State of Israel? This is one of the few occasions where both the United States and the Soviet Union agree. Communist Russia and free America do not get along. We both vote to establish the State of Israel and divide Palestine. The United Nations has a majority that does, and the plan is, as of 1948, Israel will exist. Now, why did we do it? To this day, after the Second World War and the final solution, the majority of the world's Jews, the largest population of Jews in the world, live in the United States. And they want their brothers and sisters to have safety overseas. Number two, the American people are moved and horrified by what happens to the Jews in the final solution. And they agree that the only way Jews are going to be safe is if they have their own home. Why do the Russians do it? That's a mystery. The Russians, communists, aren't known for their humanitarianism. They're pretty brutal, incredibly brutal. In fact, at that time, they were led by the second greatest mass murderer in human history, Joseph Stalin. So, for whatever reason, they also went along with it. Haj Amin al-Husseini and the other Arab countries say, the moment the British leave, we're going to invade and drive the Jews into the sea. And when the British leave, the moment they leave, 5 Arab armies with tanks, fighter planes, bombers, artillery, trucks, and national infrastructures behind them invade the Jewish state from all sides. The Jews have small arms, the Haganah and the Irgun, and that's it. They don't have any of the other stuff. Haj Amin al-Husseini says to the Arabs living in the Jewish area, and in general, leave. Leave your homes, leave your businesses, join the armies invading, come back as conquerors. The Jews were appealing to the Arabs to stay in their homes and help defend the state of Israel, which is going to be a home to Arabs as well as Jews, Muslims as well as Israelis. Most Palestinian Arabs leave, following the orders of their religious leader, Haj Amin al-Husseini. 48, 49, into 1950. The Arabs fight the Jews. The Jews acquire tanks, artillery, fighter planes, bombers, and win. Israel survives. 5 Arab armies are defeated. The Jews hold the line. At this point, many of the Arabs who left to try to conquer Israel wanted back in. The Israeli government said, no, you left. You, in fact, didn't just leave us in our time of need. You left us to join our enemies who wanted to destroy us. No, you are not coming back. Your homes are forfeit. Your businesses and farms are now ours, and we will give them to Jews and Arabs who helped us. From that moment, Palestinians become refugees. And I'll call them Palestinians because this is what really makes them as a nation. They claim a so-called right to return, which means a right to come back and take the homes that they abandoned during the war. Israel steadfastly refuses any such right. So where do the Palestinians go now that Israel exists? Well, many of them go to Jordan, which includes the West Bank at this point. Some go to Egypt, some go to Syria, some go to Lebanon, some go to Arabia. Do their fellow Arabs and Muslims take them in with open arms? Absolutely not! What the Arabs do is they put their own brothers and sisters into refugee camps. Stinking, sandy, flea-ridden, disease-plagued refugee camps. And they keep them there throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Ain't that grand? So instead of accepting Palestinian Arabs into, say, Jordan or Egypt or Syria as fellow Muslims and fellow Arabs and brothers and sisters under Allah, they treat them like the scum of the earth. Desperate, weak, outcast. Generations of Palestinians grow up in these camps. Generations of Palestinians learn nothing but hate. And this is going to play a role down to the present moment. A series of ongoing Arab-Israeli wars is going to be one result. Okay. In 1956, Egypt has taken control of the Suez Canal, which had been built by the French and administered by the British since it was built. The Suez Canal is the global choke point of trade. In terms of shipping, it's the most important place on earth. The British Empire controlled it because the British Empire was a naval empire, and it needed control of choke points like this, and it had it. But after World War II, British gives up Egypt, which had been part of the British Empire. But the Egyptians had promised to leave the Suez Canal zone under British rule, French rule. But in 1956, that changed. An aggressive Egyptian leader wanted it. So the British and the French plan a commando raid to take it back, and as a distraction, they get the Israelis to invade the Sinai Peninsula. So this is Sinai. It's where Moses was exiled to after he had to leave Egypt because of the murder of the Egyptian. Egypt is surprise attacked by Israel. Egyptian forces are driven out of Sinai very quickly. The Israelis are approaching the Canal, and the British and French claim that they're trying to keep the peace by placing their forces along the Canal to separate the Israelis from the Egyptians. It's a scam. And nobody buys it. Again, the Russians and the Americans agree on something. This is a cheap imperialist stunt, and they demand that the British and French leave, that the Israelis withdraw, and that Egypt get its land back. Well, the British and French are humiliated, and the Israelis not so much. They pull back, but they beat the Egyptian army, the best army in the Arab world, lickety-split, drove them right out of Sinai. They earned face. They earned status. However, the leader of Egypt isn't done. In the early 1960s, when Syria is weak, the leader of Egypt proposes that Syria and Egypt join together into a single country called the United Arab Republic. And he is planning a war against Israel, openly, where Egypt will attack from the south, Syria from the north, and Israel will be cracked in between like a nut in a nutcracker. In 1967, the Egyptians and Syrians are almost ready to attack. And the Israelis say to themselves, why are we waiting? We know what they're going to do. We know that they're going to come after us. Let's hit them before they hit us. And in the early morning hours of June 1967, Israeli fighter bombers destroy the Egyptian and Syrian air forces on the ground. Only a few planes left in both. The Israelis also invade Gaza, the Jordanian West Bank, and the Golan Heights up here, which was part of Syria at that time. The Arabs try fighting back, pathetically. The Israelis take the entire city of Jerusalem, which had been split between Jew and Arab. In 6 days, they do all this, and the United Nations sets up a peace plan. And the peace plan, which the Arabs absolutely hate, give Israel control of everything up to the east bank of the Suez Canal, all of Sinai, and the west bank of the Jordan River, and the Golan Heights, including the entire city of Jerusalem. Everything has changed. Israel is now not less than 10 miles wide at its narrowest point. Israel has a hilly frontier with the Syrians. Israel has some space between it and Egypt. Messing with Israel, bad idea. Also, the Israelis did it with largely American equipment. So the Americans are happy because, the Arabs were using Russian equipment. And at that point, it looked like we might be in a war with the Russians at any moment. So it's nice to know that American equipment in Israeli hands beat Soviet equipment in Arab hands. The Arabs aren't done. They go back to the Soviets and they get a whole bunch of new weapons immediately. In 1972, a taste of things to come happens. The Winter Olympics are being held in Munich, Germany. Munich, Germany is where Hitler got his political start. Munich, Germany is being revived in the eyes of the world as a decent place. Having the Olympics is a huge deal to the Germans, the West Germans, to the Free Germans. So winter athletes from all over the world gather in Munich, including an Israeli team. However, that Israeli team is captured by Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, terrorists. For days they are held as negotiations go on. Finally, the decision is made to use force. But when the German special forces arrive, absolutely every Israeli athlete and coach has been murdered. The world is shocked. The Arabs didn't just attack the Israelis, they attacked the entire world order, symbolically by attacking the Olympics. And by killing the entire team, they made it clear that they weren't messing around. Terrorism begins to get more appealing. In October of 1973, the Egyptians are ready to pay the Israelis back. See, the Israelis had built a defensive fortification along the eastern shore of the Suez Canal. It starts with a big berm, that's a big earthwork wall. It has pillboxes, machine gun nests, artillery, tank traps. This defensive barrier is named after the Israeli general who designed it. It's called the Bar-Lev Line. The Israelis have beaten the Arabs every time they fought. The Egyptians are safely excised by the waters of the Suez Canal and then the Bar-Lev Line. The Israelis are riding high in their confidence. In October of 1973, because everything seems peaceful, over half the Israeli military is sent home on leave for the highest holy day of the Jewish year, Yom Kippur, the feast day of atonement, where you meditate upon your sins with your loved ones. You try to atone for those sins to God. So the Israeli military is in full peacetime mode. But the Egyptians have managed to snooker them, sneaking tens of thousands of Egyptian troops to their side of the canal and hiding them underground. Buses come in, filled with troops. Buses leave, apparently filled with troops. And the Israelis think that the Egyptians are just bringing their troops up, showing them the canal zone and the Bar-Lev Line, and then sending them home. They're not sending them home. It's a trick. Early in the morning of Yom Kippur, fire hoses blast the berm of the Bar-Lev Line. Like the incoming tide destroying a sandcastle, the berm collapses in places. And the Egyptians lay bridges and send tanks across the canal, through and behind the Bar-Lev Line, before anyone realizes it. The local forces try to fight back, but they're at half strength because of the high holy day of Yom Kippur. It is disaster. The Egyptian army has won its first battle with the Israeli army. They're in the process of taking the Bar-Lev Line and also surging tanks across Sinai towards Israel proper. The only thing the Israelis can do is to use their superior air power. So the Israeli Air Force, its fighters, its bombers, its fighter bombers, fly in to hit the Egyptian tanks. But it's a trap. It's a trap. It's a trap. The Soviet military doctrine in 1973 was, if it flies, it dies. Their armies were equipped with massive numbers of anti-aircraft guns and missiles. they assumed that American and European air forces would control the air. So their army is designed to basically kill anything that flies overhead. When the Israeli Air Force goes in to hit the Egyptian army east of the Bar-Lev line, the Egyptian army is waiting for them. And suddenly the sky is filled with stars, each star an exploding Israeli jet. The Israeli Air Force pulls back, mauled and shot. The Egyptians consolidate the Bar-Lev line and move towards Israel even faster. Meanwhile, at the same moment that the attacks along Bar-Lev happened, the Syrians launched several tank armies into the Golan Heights region, the hill country south of Damascus that Israel now controls. And at first, they break through the Israeli lines. It looks like the Nutcracker, the pincers attack, is going to work. Shh! I've got a secret. Don't tell anyone. In 1973, the Israelis have nuclear weapons. And they begin to activate them. It takes time. They begin assembling their atom bombs and their atomic missile warheads. The Israelis have long said they're not going down without a fight. And if the Arabs, they look like they are right now, are going to conquer us, we'll turn Cairo and Damascus, cities of millions of people, into radioactive glass. We'll hit their armies in the field with atomics. We'll hit their cities behind the lines with atomics. So Israel, in its desperate moment, begins to activate its nuclear weapons. President Nixon and American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger realize if Israel is desperate, they will launch their nukes. If they use atomic weapons anywhere on the battlefield, and especially against cities like Cairo and Damascus, the Arab world will rise up as one to try to destroy Israel, and they'll also demand that the Soviet Union use its nuclear weapons to punish Israel. If the Soviets, under Arab pressure, nuke Jerusalem in atomic fire, or Tel Aviv, or any of the other cities in Israel, the United States, which is Israel's closest ally and chief benefactor, will then be forced to nuke the Russian silos and bases from which those attacks happened. If that were to happen, we are basically marching towards global thermonuclear war and Armageddon, the end of the world as we know it. To prevent this, President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger set up an emergency airlift from the United States to Israel, shipping in weapons, medical supplies. The Americans share live satellite data with the Israelis. The satellites tell precisely, moment by moment, where the Egyptian tanks are. With this airlift, and with the intelligence given by the American satellites, the Israelis fight back without having to use their atomic weapons. They drive the Syrians back beyond the Golan Heights, and Israeli tanks are on their way to Damascus. They drive the Egyptian army back, mostly across the Suez, and Israeli forces are now west of the Suez, within striking distance of Cairo. The United Nations brokers peace, and the Yom Kippur War of 1973 ends. Now, there are some results of this that stick with us to this day. Result number one. America doesn't know it yet, but the war on terror has already begun. The war on terror from the terrorist point of view, begins in October of 1973. Why? Because America demonstrates that Israel will never be allowed to fall so long as the United States is a global superpower. So long as the United States has the ability to save Israel, Israel will always be saved. At that moment, in the minds of our terrorist enemies, Israel becomes the little Satan. We become the great Satan. And it's going to be an increasing open season on Americans from Muslim terrorists, from Arab terrorists. That's number one. Number two, something good. The Syrians are spanked and humiliated, but the Egyptians know that for the only time in history an Arab army stood against an Israeli army and won, and that it took the Americans to help the Israelis fight Egypt back. This gives the leader of Egypt, a different guy than was there before, the confidence to say, we can be magnanimous. I will go to Jerusalem and I will talk peace. President Sadat of Egypt does just that. And when President Sadat of Egypt goes to Jerusalem and Israel to talk peace, it sets up a process that by 1978, my apologies, will bring both President Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Begin of Israel to Camp David, Maryland, in the United States, hosted by President Carter. And they will sign the first peace treaty between the Arabs and the Israelis, the Camp David Accords. In the Camp David Accords, Egypt promises to remain at peace with Israel. Israel promises to, year by year, give up the Sinai Peninsula, give it back to Egypt in stages. Both Israel and Egypt keep their word, and Egypt, up until the year 2020, is the only Arab country to ever make peace with the Israelis. And without the Egyptian army, the Arabs cannot win a conventional war. They have to use terrorism or nuclear weapons. Without the Egyptian army, the Arabs simply don't have the manpower and the force to conquer Israel with tanks, planes, and guns. So that's a huge benefit that comes from the Yom Kippur War. Here's another downside, though. The Arab world is angry at the United States for getting involved. And they're going to punish us. So in 1973-74, the Arabs, who produce most of the world's oil, embargo us. That means they won't sell oil to us for months and months and months. And the United States, even though we are an oil-producing country, is a giant importer of Arab oil in 1973. So when the Arabs cut off our oil, it changes things in this country very big, very basically. Here's how. Before 1973, an average paperback book cost 99 cents. And a gallon of gas cost well under $1. The average working man could support his wife and children on his salary, one salary. But everything, and I mean everything, is shipped using an oil product. Gasoline is a product of petroleum. It's a product of oil. Oil used in fuel and lubrication is an oil product, a product of oil. Plastics are made with oil. Some foods are grown not with soybean oil, but with petroleum. There are all sorts of uses that oil is put to in the modern world. And now we don't have a steady supply. So what happens, first of all, is there's gasoline rationing. If your license plate ends with an odd number or certain letters, you get to go to get gas on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. If you've got an even number or a different set of letters, you get to buy gas on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. you can only buy $5 or $10 worth of gas. You're limited to the amount of gas you can buy. So you can only buy on certain days, you can only buy a certain amount, and people get desperate. You know how toilet paper disappeared from supermarkets last year because people got panicky and some people hoarded it. Well, there were gasoline lines. You'd have to go 2 or 3 hours, spend 2 or 3 hours in a gasoline line just to get a partial tank of gas. The prices of everything went through the roof. By 1978-79, the same paperback book that had been worth 99 cents before the oil embargo was now costed $4.99. That's a fivefold increase. Well, let's see. Yeah, $1 to $5, fivefold increase. Everything, food, housing, everything, much more expensive because the shipping costs were more expensive for everything. Now, just because the prices of everything goes up, do you think that the wages and salaries of people went up commensurately? Absolutely not. Women enter the workforce in the mid-1970s like never before. Not because the women finally have been liberated, but because to maintain the standard of living to which they had become accustomed, many American families who were on the edge were pushed over the edge by the inflation, the reduction in the value of each dollar. Cost more and more dollars to get the same thing. So, to keep that living standard, women entered the workforce, taking part-time jobs or full-time jobs, so that the family can maintain its standard of living. This changes the American family, increases divorce rates, increases the number of children raised by daycare rather than by their mom, has a fundamental effect on the American society and economy, and it can be traced back, and there are many factors, this is one, but it's a big factor. It can be traced back to the Arab oil embargo of 1973-74. Finally, from 1979 to 1981, the American ally, Iran, had its government overthrown in 1978. The government, the Shah of Iran, an ally of the United States, was allowed to be overthrown by the American president, Jimmy Carter, because the Shah was tough and used brutal force against his enemies. Carter punished him and allowed him to fall. And the Shah was replaced by a vehemently anti-American government called the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is still the government of Iran today. The government of Iran today is the nexus point of global terrorism. So long as this government in Iran exists, global terror will be a problem. Also, this government in Iran is in the process of trying to make nuclear weapons. Whether they've done it yet or not, they're certainly trying to make them. Iran is a problem, and they demonstrate this less than a year after they take power. In 1979, Iranian students take control of the United States Embassy, our diplomatic offices, in their capital city of Tehran. Now, usually the government of a country where we have an embassy will use its police and military to protect our embassy if it gets attacked like this. But the Iranian government says, nothing we can do, they're just a bunch of independent students. Here's a secret. The Iranians were behind it. The government of Iran made this happen. For 444 days, America was held hostage. That is what our news media said every night on the news. Day 333, America held hostage. This is a result of the Yom Kippur War. We are the great Satan. So the government of Iran wants to try to humiliate us by taking our people hostage and not letting them go. And when President Carter in the spring of 1979 tries to free the hostages using military force. Well, after year of President Carter cutting the military budget, our military flubs it. We have a crash between an aircraft and a helicopter, giant fireball seen from hundreds of miles around, an Iranian tour bus drives by an area of the desert that's supposed to be completely safe. We look like incompetent idiots. The hostages' conditions worsen. The Iran hostage crisis changes the course of American history. President Carter loses the 1980 presidential election to conservative Republican Ronald Reagan. Reagan publicly said, if they are holding hostages, I will bomb these savages back to the Stone Age. They will receive war. These barbarians will be treated as barbarians. In other words, Reagan's not diplomatic. He's openly threatening the Iranians with war. Less than an hour after the oath of office is taken by Ronald Reagan, a plane full carrying all the American hostages leaves Iranian airspace. The Iranians do not want to be holding hostages with this president. And America says, oh, it's over. The Iran hostage crisis is over. Yes, it is. But the Iranian government continues to rule Iran to this day, and the war on terror goes on. Next time, we will go through various elements that lead to the war on terror quickly, and we will probably see the movie on Friday. That means your essays on terror weight will be due Monday. Also due Monday is Chapter Survey 2. So be ready for that. And I will talk to you about creation myth stuff later on this week or early next week. Ta-ta!